Hey, this is Joe Gilder from Home Studio Corner, and today we're going to dive into something that is a really common question. And the question is, how do we choose which frequencies to cut? Now, real quickly, I'm a big fan of subtractive EQ, so I'm not going to explain that right now, but I think it's better to cut the things you don't want than to boost the things you do, because mixes are already pretty involved, so it'd be nice to remove things that don't need to be there rather than adding more to the mix. But the first question we want to ask ourselves is, why are we even using EQ? Why do we have it? Why is it in our mixes? Well, the simplest and probably overly simplified answer is we're taking tracks that sound bad and we're trying to make them sound good. Trying to make them at least sound better. Or probably more accurately, we're trying to take tracks that don't fit into the mix and make them fit into the mix. Okay? Raw tracks, even though our life goal is to get it right at the source, there's always going to be something that those tracks need in order to be what they need to be for the mix to work. And EQ is a big tool that we use in order to get there, okay? So I've not told you anything you don't already know, just want to cover the basics real quick. Here's a question for you. Let's say I asked you for directions. Like I walked up to you at a gas station and said, hey, could you give me directions? What would your first question be? What would you ask me next? Obviously, you would ask me, what is my destination? If I just said, hey, give me directions, and you said, where are you going? And I said, oh, I don't know. Just give me directions. It'd be ridiculous, right? We got to know where we're going. This brings me to something, if you've never read a book by Stephen Covey called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, read it if you want, but here's one of the things that I remember. I read it probably 12 years ago, but it goes like this. Begin with the end in mind. Okay? So rather than, here's a couple of EQ knobs, rather than just randomly tweaking knobs and hoping and praying, this is supposed to be praying hands, praying that we get where we want to go, we need to know where we want to go before we head out. Right? We don't just jump in the car and just drive. Usually we have a destination in mind and that's where we're headed. It's the same thing with EQ. So what does that mean? Well, am I just being like all philosophical here, or is there a point? Yes, of course there is a point. The way we get here, the way we know where our destination is we have to get good at and practice listening. I know that's not the big fancy huge, awesome hack that you might be looking for to get better music, but that's the answer right here, is to get good at learning how to listen to your tracks. So how do we do that? Well, the biggest thing you can do to make yourself better at listening is to do more listening of this box is looking terrible, of professionally produced tracks in your studio. That means sit down in your studio, plop yourself and your big old ears down between the speakers and listen to some really good music. The only way you're going to know how to identify your destination is by listening to really good music out of your speakers. So a lot of people, the common mistake they'll make is they only listen to their own mixes in their studio. They never listen to good stuff. Well, how are you going to know what to EQ to get those guitars to sit, or get that vocal to sound right, or get that kick drum to sound like you want it to sound, if you don't first know what good mixes sound like coming out of your speakers in your studio? The answer is you can't. Now, I'm not talking about copying what someone else has done. You can still absolutely be creative, but the only way to know what sounds good is to familiarize yourself with what sounds good. Pay attention to what the guitars and the drums and the vocals and the synths and the background instruments and the foreground lead instruments, what do they all sound like? What frequencies do they inhabit? How do they sound relative to everything else? Think about it this way. I'm going to draw a terrible guitar here. Let's say you're an electric guitarist and you know all the great, this is going to be a terrible Stratocaster, looks more like a bass. This is absolutely a bass. All the great guitar players What is it about, if you say like this person gets great tone, the first question is, oh man, what amps do they use, right? That's got to be the secret. Or, what pedals do they use? Because that's got to be the secret. And those are a piece of the puzzle, but the real thing is right here. These things on the side of our heads, these fleshy little floppy things on the side of our heads, it's the ears. And it's not even the ears, it's the knowledge inside that brain, inside of that guitar player, that knows what good tone is. They've been doing it for so long, they've listened to so many records, they've listened to so many shows, they've listened to so many other guitar players, that they know when they plug their guitar into that pedal and out of that pedal into that amp, they will turn these knobs and tweak all these settings until the sound coming out of the amp is a great tone. So in some ways, it doesn't matter what these things are because they're going to get a great tone because they know what great tone sounds like. That's why you give this same equipment to someone who doesn't know great tone, someone who's super confused and and crazy, and they're not going to get the same tone. Same equipment, not going to get the same tone. Why? Because this person doesn't know what good tone sounds like, and the pro guitar player does. It's the same thing with EQ in the studio. Okay, that's enough of this. Let's put the pencil away. Let's jump into Studio One, and I will walk you through listening to a very simple track with just a couple of tracks, and go through what I'm listening for, what I'm hearing, what things I'm going to cut with EQ based on what I'm hearing, and we'll boost some too, I'm sure, and really try to hone in and show you what I'm listening for, what I hear, and then what my destination is and how I'm going to use EQ to get there. Plus, bonus, you can download these tracks in a link below. So if you want to pause the video and go to the description below, there'll be a download link, just a Dropbox link for the files that I'm about to work on. You can download those to your computer, import them into your session, and then you can follow along with me if you want. It's like a mini mixing course right here. Okay, that's enough. Let's dive in. Okay, here are some tracks from one of my songs. This song is called Help Me, and I've cut it back to just the acoustic guitars and a single vocal. The album version has some percussion and other things, but for the sake of this video and this exercise, we've limited it to 5 acoustic guitars, which sounds like a lot, and 1 vocal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute everything. Right now I've got everything, basic levels set. I mean, the levels are really all right around 0. The first guitar is up the middle. Second and third are panned left and right. Fourth and fifth are also panned hard left and right. So you can do that and you'll be right there with me. But real quickly, let me just play what the guitars are doing right here at the beginning, and then we'll kind of go through this exercise of figuring out what to do with EQ.
As long as I can remember, I was never afraid of the dark.
Okay, so let's do this. Let's mute all but the first acoustic guitar, because that's the main instrument that plays throughout the entire song, and I usually say vocals for last anyway. And let's get that guitar sounding right, and then figure out what the other guitars need to sound like to fit together. Now, one thing you thought you might have right off the bat is, wow, those guitars already sound good. I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back. I'm simply saying it to make a point that the better you can make your recordings sound raw, there's nothing on these, there's no plugins here, the much more fun you're going to have mixing, and the better your mixes are going to sound. So if you're starting with tracks that are really, really hard to listen to, you can improve them with mixing, but boy, if you get better at the recording side of things, you'll realize, oh, mixing is fun, and is actually can be fairly easy because the starting material is so good. So I'm not going to harp on that anymore, but here's the first guitar. Let's just listen and decide what, if anything, it needs. Okay, now, I've recorded acoustic guitar more than any other instrument because that was my primary instrument for years. That and vocals, I've spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours recording and mixing. So I have spent a lot of time figuring out what sounds good on acoustic guitar. And also I've listened to lots of records with acoustic guitar and become familiar with what great acoustic guitar sounds like. The main thing that I hear when I listen to this that stands out as not quite right is down in the lower frequencies, there's this thump, thump. It happens on the beat. Every time I down strum, I'm playing with one of these smaller but thicker jazz picks, which when I down strum on the guitar, it gives this kind of thump sort of sound. Which makes it feel kind of muddy. Now, with an acoustic track like this, I want to keep the warmth. I don't want to lose it and make it super thin because there aren't drums and bass and electric guitars to fill out that low end. But I do want to take care of that thumpiness because it gets worse as more guitars come in because they all have that same sort of fundamental thump. So listen for thump, 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 bump, thump, thump. That's where the thump is, timing-wise. You can even see it visually in the waveform where it jumps up in volume right here, 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 here. Every 2 beats, that's the sound I'm having problems with in my head. It's the kind of frequency that would keep me from turning this guitar up any louder because it would start to literally give me a headache. And so knowing what I know, that is a low-mid frequency, okay? It's not a high frequency, and it's not really a mid-range frequency. It's a lower-mid frequency. So taking that information, I'm going to put an EQ on this track and try to locate that low-mid frequency. If we just hit play and look, we'll probably get a hint. Okay, there's our hint right there. If I mute the guitar now, you can see there's a big buildup right here. That's confirming what I was already hearing. Careful here, don't use the visual frequency graph to make your decisions. They can maybe affirm the decision you've already made, but for me, I was already hearing that thump thump, so I want to go take care of it. So let's go find it and then pull it down. All down in this range is where I'm hearing it. But it seems to get the most prominent right at 150 hertz. So let's pull that down a few dB and see how it sounds. Now listen to the guitar as I turn this on and off. Listen to how it goes from having this thump sound that's super annoying once you listen for it, and then it goes away and it just sounds like an acoustic guitar again. Let's take a listen. And that's what I hear on this guitar that bothers me. When I sit back and say, okay, is there anything else that we need to address on this guitar? I don't think there is. Well, oh, I turned it off. I was listening and thinking, crap, it's got that same woofiness. Let's go. Now let's listen to it. It's still got a little bit of that thump thump, but it's not nearly as pronounced as it was. And this I can live with. This I can be okay with. Maybe we come back later and pull it down more, but I'm pretty happy with that. Now for the rest of the guitar sound, I mean, you could maybe make a case for making it a little brighter, but this sounds like that guitar. This is that Gibson J45. All these tracks are that, and this is what that guitar sounds like when I'm sitting there playing it, and that's the sound that I want. And it doesn't have that excessive bump, bump, thump, thumpiness anymore, so now we can move on. So let's bring in guitars 2 and 3. So here's what they sound like by themselves. So they have similar tone to one another, and then when we add them in with the original guitar, it gives it a nice wide sound. but it brings back more of that thump, that whoomp whoomp that we were having. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bust these two guitars together because they're really playing together. We'll call this high guitar, and I'm going to put an EQ on that bus. So let's just listen to those for a second. So similar problem. It's not as bad as the original guitar because these are higher up, like capoed up, but there's still a little bit of that thump, thump, thump. So I want to take care of that even more on this one because I want these, since they're on the side, to be a little brighter. If you listen to mixes, you'll notice stuff in the middle, that's where a lot of the big bassy stuff is. And as you move towards the outside, less and less bass heavy stuff is there. All the way to the sides is generally brighter sounding. If you hear really bass heavy stuff on the sides, it feels weird. If you're on headphones, it makes it feel like your headphones are going to break. And it's just not usually what happens. That's one thing you notice when you listen critically to material. You'll notice the big thick bass drum, snare drum stuff is up the middle, and the stuff on the side still can be full and still can sound good, but it generally doesn't have a lot of low end or low mids to it. All right, let's EQ this. Now, as I'm EQing this one, I want that thump thump to go away entirely. With the first guitar, I left some of it in there because I like a little bit of it. With this one, I want to pull this EQ down until the thump 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 disappears because I don't want any of that low mid thump thump happening on these side guitars. They still sound full, they still sound beautiful, and I can even adjust the width of that EQ a little bit to take care of the thump while still letting it have some warmth to it. But it's not thick and headachy like it was before. And here are all three together. Okay, now let's see what's going on with this acoustic guitar 4 here. So it's just a little lead part. For something like that, we don't really want it to have much low end, just in case it gets full down there. And I want that to be a little brighter, because it's going to be hard to hear over everything. So let's add a little top end to that. Sounds nice. That's something that could benefit from compression, but that's not what we're going to cover here in this video. Okay, now what am I hearing? I'm still hearing a little bit of that thump thump from that original, maybe the original guitar. I'm not sure if it's that or not, so let me mute the high guitars and see if that fixes it. Now let me mute the main guitar. Yep, it's when I mute the main guitar, that thump goes away, especially on this second measure here. Right there, that boom, it just gets me, it's a little too much. So let's EQ a little more. Let's take what we did and maybe bring it down and maybe spread it out a little bit.
As long as I can remember.
That feels pretty good to me. Those guitars are now all playing together. They feel full. They sound like real guitars. There aren't any particular frequencies jumping out saying, hey, look at me. Feels a lot better to me. Actually, those high guitars feel a little bright now. Let's listen to those by themselves real quick. There's a brightness to guitars that can feel kind of plasticky and fake. It's kind of in the upper mids, 2 to 4K. Listen to that. I'm hearing a little bit of that. Let's go find it. Here's a great example. When I was up here at around 5K, that boost actually sounded nice and pleasant. But when I came down here to around 2K, it was like sort of plastic sounding. That's the frequency I was looking for. Yeah, that sounds full. The only one way to describe it is it kind of sounds a little hi-fi. It has this nice fidelity to it. And combined with the main acoustic, just a nice, big, great sounding guitar part. All right, I've taken too long on this. Let's go to the vocal. And real quickly, let's see what we need to take care of with it.
As long as I can remember.
Right out of the gate, what do you hear?
As long as I can remember.
It's a nice, full, warm-sounding vocal, but that's going to be too much in the mix. Let's listen to that warmth here.
As long as I can remember.
Whoa, 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 whoa. That frequency.
As long as I can remember.
When I sing remember, it's kind of whoa, whoa, whoa. It's too much down there. It makes it sound muddy. So muddiness is a big thing. You're gonna get tired of saying, that sounds muddy. Let me deal with it. But that's a very common and normal problem to have in your mix. So let's go listen to the vocal by itself and let's take care of it.
As long as I can remember, I was never afraid of the dark.
So that woo 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 right there, it's pretty consistent there at a little over 150. Let's just pull that down.
As long as I can remember, I was never afraid of the dark.
Now that we've done that, the vocal already sounds better. It still feels a little kind of muffled. And my first instinct would be to do something like boost the top end, but that's actually not what I want to do first. There's like a mid-range thing going on. So typically when you have a bunch of tracks, even just 4 acoustics and a vocal, there's going to be build up in the mid-range. Whether in the low mids, which you've already seen, but also in the mid-mids, like the 500 hertz or so range. Because every instrument has some good, juicy goodness down there in the 500 hertz range, but sometimes that can build up a little much and can make it sound muffled or kind of boxy. So listen to this vocal by itself. That I kind of has a whistly kind of thing going on there. It's in the mid-range. Now that's going to be harder to hear. That's a more advanced kind of thing to listen for. But let me accentuate it for you so you can hear it.
I was never afraid of the dark. I was never.
It almost sounds like resonance in like my nasal cavity. It's fine, but let's just take it down a little bit to smooth that vocal out. Not to take away all the mid-range, but to just kind of balance it a little more.
I was never afraid of the dark.
So the end result is the vocal sounds a little thinner, a little brighter. We didn't even boost top end. And by itself, it might sound like it maybe is a little thin.
I was never.
But play it with the guitars, which are already very warm instruments, and suddenly it sounds great.
I was never afraid of the dark.
Versus this before.
I was never afraid of.
It was just like wah 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 wah. I can't even listen to him. He's just going wah 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 wah. Turn the EQ on. Now it's somebody I want to listen to.
I was never afraid of the dark. As long as I've known you, I've always been.
And that's what I would do with EQ. Now with a vocal especially, compression would come next to tame the dynamics of the vocal, but EQ-wise, those are the tones that made that vocal not sound like the professional vocals that I'm used to listening to. And those are the EQ moves that made sense for me on these guitars to make them sound more like professionally produced guitars. Starting to see a trend here. It's not so much that I'm referencing in the middle of mixing all the time. It's just when I'm not working on my music, I'm listening to someone else's music and I'm analyzing it and I'm absorbing what it sounds like, so I can then spit that back out on my own tracks. Okay, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you like what you see here, you would love my new mixing course. Check it out at homestudiocorner.com/mix. You're going to love it. Thanks for watching. See ya.